Sophie was setting the table when Mark walked in, smiling in a way she hadn't seen in a while. "You'll never guess who called," he said, holding up his phone. "Julianne. She's moving back." Sophie looked up, surprised. "Julianne? From college?" He nodded. "She's flying in this weekend. Thought maybe we could invite a few friends over? Casual, welcome night." Sophie hesitated. She hadn't seen Julianne in nearly 10 years, and even then, she had felt a little uneasy around her. She was charming, confident, always had a way of taking over a room without trying. Mark and Julianne had been close before Sophie came into the picture, but they swore it was always platonic. Sophie believed them mostly. "Sure," she said. "Let's do it." Saturday came faster than expected. Sophie cleaned the house, picked out wine, and made a charcuterie board. Mark was oddly excited. He kept checking his phone and glancing at the clock. When Julianne finally arrived, she swept into the room like a warm breeze, laughing, glowing, confident as ever. "Still the same house," she said as she hugged Sophie. "You look great." Sophie smiled, unsure how to respond. Julianne had changed, grown even more magnetic. She wore a long coat, her hair loose, and her voice soft but full of energy. She hugged Mark tightly, longer than necessary, then spun around to look at the room. The night went by quickly. A few old friends joined them, but Julianne stole most of the attention. Her stories were funnier, her voice louder, her eyes always on Mark. Sophie watched as they reminisced about their college days. Their laughter was easy, familiar. Full of shared memories, Sophie couldn't join Dot. At one point, Sophie stepped into the kitchen to grab more drinks. As she came back, she saw Julianne lean close to Mark, whispering something that made him laugh. Sophie froze for just a moment before walking in. "Need help?" Julianne asked cheerfully, reaching for a glass. "You two are still such a team." "It's nice." Sophie forced a smile. "Yeah, we are." The night ended late. Friends left in waves, but Julianne lingered. "Do you mind if I stay here tonight?" she asked casually. "My hotel plans fell through." Mark jumped in before Sophie could answer. "Of course. Stay with us." Sophie nodded slowly, masking the flicker of hesitation. They set up the guest room. Sophie tried to shake off the feeling building in her chest, a quiet unease she couldn't explain. The next morning, Sophie woke up early. She walked downstairs and found Julianne already in the kitchen, barefoot, sipping coffee. "Oh, hope you don't mind," Julianne said. "Mark told me where everything is." "No problem," Sophie replied. But it felt like a stranger was moving in. The visit stretched from one day to the next. Julianne didn't leave. She said she needed time to find a place. She offered to help around the house, brought groceries, and stayed for dinner each night. Mark didn't seem to mind. In fact, he enjoyed her company. He laughed more, talked more. Sophie noticed the shift. Every time Julianne spoke, Mark listened closely. Every time Sophie tried to share something, conversation found its way back to Julianne. One evening, Sophie came home from work and heard music playing. She followed the sound and found Julianne and Mark in the living room, dancing. Just the two of them, laughing. They froze when they saw her. "Oh, hey." "We were just being silly," Mark said, stepping back quickly. Julianne smiled. "You have such a good man, Sophie." Sophie nodded, her heart sinking. Later that night, Sophie and Mark lay in bed. She turned toward him and asked softly, "Do you think she's staying too long?" He sighed. "She just needs a few more days. She doesn't really have anyone else here." Sophie wanted to believe that. But deep down, she could feel something shifting. The next day, she found Julianne and Mark in the kitchen, heads close together, laughing over something on his phone. They looked up, and for a moment Sophie felt like the outsider at dinner. The silence between Sophie and Mark grew louder. Julianne carried most of the conversation. Sophie listened, her food untouched. After dinner, Julianne offered to clean up. "You two relax," she said. Sophie walked outside, needing air. The wind was cool, but her thoughts were louder than the breeze. How had things changed so quickly? When did her home stop feeling like hers? That night, she couldn't sleep. She looked at Mark. peacefully resting beside her, and wondered if he felt anything unusual or if she was the only one sensing the distance. Julianne stayed another day. Then another. Sophie started noticing the little things. The way Julianne looked at Mark when she thought no one saw. The way Mark talked more to Julianne in one evening than he had to Sophie in a week. The way they shared jokes, glances, silences. Sophie began to pull back. She stopped asking questions, stopped trying to compete. But she watched. And what she saw told her everything she needed to know. Julianne wasn't just a guest anymore. She was part of something else. Something Sophie hadn't been invited into. Sophie noticed the change almost immediately. Julianne had gone from guest to constant presence. She woke up with them, drank coffee at their table, offered to help with errands, and even sat beside Mark during movie nights, a spot Sophie used to fill. Everything looked normal on the surface, but the atmosphere in the house had shifted. Mark didn't seem to notice. Or maybe he did and just didn't care. He smiled more. He laughed more. He listened when Julianne talked, his eyes focused and present, the way he used to look at Sophie years ago. Sophie tried to ignore it at first. She reminded herself they were just old friends, catching up after years apart. But the feeling in her chest told her otherwise. One morning, Sophie found them in the kitchen, cooking breakfast together. Julianne was wearing one of Mark's old t-shirts. Sophie stood there, frozen in the doorway, watching them flip pancakes and laugh at some inside joke. Mark turned, surprised to see her. "Hey, we made extra," he said casually. As if nothing was strange, Sophie forced a smile. "Thanks," she replied, taking a seat. But her stomach churned. Something felt wrong. Very wrong. That day, Sophie sat in her car during lunch break and stared out the windshield. She couldn't focus at work. Her mind kept replaying the scenes from home. Mark used to text her during the day. Lately, he barely checked in. She wondered if he was texting Julianne instead. That evening, she checked his phone. She didn't want to. She hated the idea of spying, but curiosity and fear got the best of her. She found nothing explicit, but what she saw still hurt. Messages full of inside jokes, heart emojis, and late night you up texts. It was emotional, intimate, and more than friendship. She didn't confront Mark. Not yet. She didn't even know what to say. Instead, she tried harder to reconnect with him. She suggested date nights, short getaways, simple walks. He always had an excuse. Tired from work, had a headache, maybe next weekend. Julianne, on the other hand, always had time for him. One night, Sophie planned a quiet dinner. She cooked Mark's favorite pasta, lit candles, and set the table for two. Just as they were about to sit down, Julianne walked in, holding takeout and laughing. "Sorry," she said cheerfully. "I didn't know you were doing something special. Want to join me in the living room later?" Sophie looked at Mark, hoping he would say something. He didn't. He just nodded and muttered, "We'll see." The dinner was silent. Sophie barely ate. Mark seemed distracted. She finally asked, "Do you even want this marriage anymore?" Mark blinked. "Of course I do." "Then why does it feel like I'm not even in it anymore?" Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. Mark sighed. "I'm just tired, Sophie. You're reading too much into things." But Sophie wasn't. She knew something deeper was happening. The next day, Sophie took a long walk after work. She didn't want to go home. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a place she once belonged to. When she finally returned, she heard music from the living room. She peeked in quietly. Julianne and Mark were sitting close, sharing headphones, smiling at something on his phone. They didn't notice her, and that hurt more than anything. That night, Sophie lay awake while Mark slept. She stared at the ceiling, wondering how it all changed so fast. They used to be so in sync now. She felt like a shadow in her own marriage. The next morning, she decided to talk to Julianne directly. They were alone in the kitchen, and Sophie calmly said, "Can I ask you something?" Julianne nodded, stirring her tea. "What are you really doing here?" Julianne paused. "I told you. I needed a place to stay for a while." "You could have found an apartment by now," Sophie said. You've made yourself very comfortable here." Julianne didn't get defensive. She simply said, "I didn't mean to cause problems. But if there are cracks, I didn't make them." That hit hard. Sophie didn't respond. She just walked away, knowing the conversation confirmed what she already feared. Later that day, Sophie suggested they all sit down, her, Mark, and Julianne. It felt odd, like a meeting at work, but she needed clarity. "I need to know where we stand," she told Mark, "because this situation can't go on." Julianne sat quietly. Mark looked torn. "I never meant to hurt you," he began. "Julianne and we've just been reconnecting. But nothing has happened, I swear." "But something has changed," Sophie said, "and we all feel it." Mark didn't argue. He nodded slowly. Sophie turned to Julianne. "I think it's time you found your own place." Julianne looked surprised. Maybe she hadn't expected Sophie to take control. "Okay," she said after a pause. "I understand." That evening was quiet. No music, no shared laughter, no stolen glances. Julianne packed her things the next day. She said goodbye politely and left without much emotion. Mark didn't follow her out. He just stood by the window, silent. Sophie and Mark sat at the kitchen table, both staring at the untouched coffee in front of them. "Now what?" Sophie asked. "I don't know," Mark admitted. "But maybe now we can start talking." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't closure. But it was a beginning, one that Sophie wasn't sure she wanted. But one she knew she needed to explore. Because even after the storm, some houses can be rebuilt. And some can't. It was quieter. Almost too quiet. The music had stopped, the playful energy was gone, and Sophie and Mark were left with something heavier. Silence. At first, Sophie thought maybe the absence would bring clarity. Maybe Mark would turn back toward her and remember what they had built. But it didn't happen right away. Mark kept to himself more. Sitting outside for long stretches, staring at the lake in the distance, Sophie busied herself with chores, work, and anything else that would keep her mind from circling the same question. Was he really still mine? They shared the same space, but it felt like two separate worlds. There were no arguments, no shouting, just a quiet distance that seemed to stretch wider with each passing day. Sophie missed the version of Mark who used to check in during the day, who would rest his hand on hers while watching TV, who made her feel seen. Now, she felt invisible. One Sunday morning, over coffee, Sophie finally said it. "Do you still love me, Mark?" He didn't answer right away. His fingers tapped the mug slowly. "I do," he said quietly. "But I don't know what kind of love it is anymore." That cut deeper than she expected. Sophie nodded. She'd feared that answer for weeks, but hearing it out loud made it real. "I need the truth," she said, looking directly at him. "Not out of anger, not to fight. Just so I can move forward." Mark took a deep breath. "When Julianne came back, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just excitement, but being wanted. Like I mattered again." Sophie's chest tightened. "So I don't make you feel that way." "It's not your fault," he replied quickly. "We fell into routine. You're stable, kind, loyal. But with Julianne, I felt alive. It was like waking up from something." Sophie stared down at her hands. They had built a life together. A house, years of memories. She had been loyal through everything. His job loss, his father's illness, the late nights, the long silences. She had stayed. And now she wasn't enough. "I never crossed the line," Mark added, almost defensively. "Nothing physical. But I know emotional betrayal counts too." Sophie nodded slowly. "It does." That night, Sophie sat on their bed alone. Mark had gone for a walk, and she wasn't sure if he would come back. She looked around the room, the same space where they had shared laughs, quiet tears, whispered promises. She felt a strange sense of grief, not just for what had happened, but for the version of them that no longer existed. She began packing a small overnight bag. Not because she wanted to run, but because she needed space to breathe. When Mark returned, she met him at the door. I'm going to my sister's for a few days, she said gently. I need time to think. Mark didn't protest. I understand. At her sister's house, Sophie allowed herself to cry, the kind of deep, full-hearted crying she hadn't let herself feel in weeks. Her sister Emily just held her. You didn't do anything wrong, Emily whispered. You loved? You stayed. That's not weakness. Sophie thought about that all night. She wasn't perfect, and neither was Mark. But loyalty should mean something. Commitment should matter. She had spent so long holding everything together that she forgot she deserved to be chosen, not just tolerated. After 3 days, Mark called. His voice was soft, unsure. Can we talk? Sophie agreed to meet at the little park by the lake, the one where they used to walk in their early years. She arrived first, watching the water shimmer in the afternoon sun. Mark joined her minutes later, hands in his pockets, face tired. I've been thinking, he began. About us. About everything. Sophie let him speak. I miss you, he said. Not just the routines. I miss your voice in the mornings. The way you remember things, I forget. The way you show up even when I don't deserve it. Sophie listened, unsure what to feel. But he continued. I also know something broke between us. And I let someone else in where only you should have been. He looked up, eyes searching hers. I want to fix this, if you'll let me, he said. I want to try. Sophie's heart swelled and sank at the same time. She loved him deeply, but she also knew healing couldn't be rushed. You broke my trust, Mark, she said softly. And even if nothing physical happened, you gave the best parts of you to someone else while I was still here. He nodded, ashamed. I know. I need to see actions, Sophie continued. Not promises. Real effort, counseling, honesty. No more hiding. Anything. Mark said. They agreed to try. Slowly, carefully. In the weeks that followed, Mark booked a counselor. They sat through hard conversations. Sophie listened. Mark listened harder. There were tears and there were awkward silences. But there were also moments of clarity where they remembered who they once were. Julianne never reached out again. Mark deleted her number without being asked. Sophie appreciated that. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. One night, after a long day, they sat on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the stars. Do you believe we'll get through this? Mark asked. Sophie leaned her head against his shoulder. I don't know, she admitted. But I believe we're trying. And for now, that's enough. They didn't rush back to how things were. They didn't pretend everything was fine. They walked through the mess slowly, honestly. Together, and in those quiet moments, Sophie realized something important. Love wasn't just about staying. It was about being chosen, even after the storm. The days that followed were slow, quiet, and full of hard work. Sophie and Mark had decided to stay in the same house, but everything between them felt fragile. It wasn't the same as starting fresh. It was more like clearing away broken pieces and deciding what could still be rebuilt. They started attending weekly marriage counseling. At first, the sessions were tense. Sophie didn't speak much. Mark looked uncomfortable. But week by week, the silence gave way to truth. They talked about the loneliness that had crept in over the years. They talked about the walls that had quietly gone up between them. And eventually, they talked about Julianne. Mark admitted he had gotten caught up in something that made him feel alive. But it wasn't real, he said in one session, eyes fixed on the floor. It felt exciting because it was easy. Sophie wasn't easy. You were real. You showed up every day, and I took that for granted. Hearing that hurt, but it also brought Sophie a kind of closure she didn't know she needed. At home, things were still awkward. Meals were quieter than they used to be. Small talk felt forced. But Sophie noticed the small efforts. Mark started texting her during the day again. He cleaned up without being asked. He made her coffee in the mornings and sometimes just sat next to her without trying to fix anything, just to be present. One evening, he brought home a small bouquet of wildflowers. I passed these and thought of you, he said. Sophie didn't say much. But she placed them in a vase and kept them by the kitchen window. It was a tiny moment, but it stayed with her. She wasn't sure she trusted him fully again. How could she so soon? But she was also aware of the love that still existed between them, quiet. Bruised but not gone. Sophie spent more time with herself, too. She joined a local painting class on Thursday nights. She hadn't picked up a paintbrush in years, but something about doing something just for her felt freeing. After class, she'd walk to this small cafe down the street and write in her journal. It became her time to process everything without pressure, without pretending. Mark noticed the change. One night, when she returned from class, he looked up from the couch and smiled. "You seem lighter," he said. "I think I am," she replied. And she meant it. One Saturday, Mark suggested a drive to the coast. Just the two of them. Sophie hesitated, but agreed. The drive was long and quiet at first. But then they started talking about nothing important. About music. About how much gas cost when they first met. About how they used to dream of buying a cabin by the lake. When they reached the beach, Mark took her hand gently. It had been weeks since he'd done that. Sophie led him. They walked along the shore in silence, the waves crashing nearby. The wind soft on their faces. "I know I messed up," Mark said finally. "I can't take it back, but I want to be better. Not just for you. For us." Sophie nodded. "I want to see if we can find our way again. But it has to be real, honest. No more pretending things are fine when they're not." "I understand," he said. They stood together for a while, the sun dipping low in the sky. No grand promises were made. No dramatic kiss. Just two people choosing, again, to try. Back home, the pace of healing was slow but steady. They set new rules for themselves. Open communication. No hiding emotions. Time apart when needed, but always with the intention of coming back together. And they held each other accountable, kindly but clearly. Months passed.